Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm really excited about the upcoming ASA conference that will be happening later this year in New Zealand. I have received official notification that my abstract has been accepted. So I'm going to be there with bells on. I'm going to be recording episodes of the podcast and presenting my research. I really hope to see you there also. So if you're interested in animal studies and you want to attend an absolutely fantastic conference, have a think about the upcoming ASA conference, Decolonising Animals, and I hope to see you there. Okay, let's get down to business. This week, I come to you once again from the beautiful University of Sheffield. It's bitterly cold, but it is somewhat sunny here in the lovely city of Sheffield. I'm really lucky to be joined once again by by a member of the absolutely fantastic Biosec team. I've been just blown away with their research and thinking about animal issues from another perspective. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined by another member of their team. So this week, we're going to be speaking to Dr. Francis Massé, did I do that wrong? No. Massé. Francis is a Post-Doctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield. As I said, he's a member of the fantastic Biosec team. And today we're going to discuss his paper, Anti-Poaching's Politics of Invisibility, Representing Nature and Conservation Amidst a Post-Poaching Crisis, which appeared in the journal Geoforum in 2018. Welcome to the podcast, Francis.
Good morning.
So, Francis, why this work? What inspired it?
This work comes out of my PhD research, which was really looking at what is happening in terms of what some are calling this poaching crisis, specifically commercial poaching crisis of elephants, rhinos, and sort of those big charismatic megafauna species. And I spent a lot of time, about 6 months, living with rangers on what some call the front lines of, the war on poaching. And as much as I don't like that term, that's how it's talked about. So as in Mozambique, South Africa borderlands, what is being done to address this poaching crisis? And one of the things that inspired me to write this particular piece is, what are the implications for conservation and the other species and ecological dynamics that the specific anti-poaching doesn't focus on? So in my research, there's a lot of focus where everything, attention, resources is going towards protect the rhino from the poacher, protect the rhino from the poacher. And this article tries to get a bit at, how does that frame what conservation is and how it gets funded and supported, and then what are the implications of that for the non-rhino and for other conservation dynamics that are just as or even more important to sort of wider biodiversity and ecosystem dynamics.
Interesting. So there's a lot to discuss about this paper, and I don't want to skip too far ahead too quickly, but can you start by telling us why certain animals are targeted, or which animals are targeted, or perhaps that's just a myth that certain animals are more targeted than others?
I think there is a bit of a myth aspect in the sense that the animals that we often hear talked about, such as the rhino, the elephant, the lion, the tiger, which are often, those campaign species, even outside of this context of poaching, are not necessarily the ones that are the most trafficked or most targeted. So getting more attention is the pangolin, which now has that tagline of the most trafficked animal you've never heard of. I think being never heard of is changing a lot in the past year, but pangolin's one of those examples. Jared Margulies was on here the other day speaking about cacti. I think orchids as well are again, not an animal per se, but one of those trafficked species most endangered we don't talk about. So there's a whole list of species that are more trafficked, more endangered than the charismatic megafauna, but don't necessarily get the attention. But why do some species get targeted in terms of trafficking and commercial poaching? I think it really comes down to the monetary value that's attached to them. So rhino horn ranges anywhere from about $40,000 to $60,000 a kilo on the black market right now. Ivory goes for about maybe $1,000 to $2,000 a kilo on the black market. So it's massive sums of money. And when you think about that in the terms of how much does the person on the ground in the source areas get for killing a rhino and bringing that horn back to a buyer, we're talking huge, huge amounts of money. And then for other species, there is also sort of the opportunistic factor as well.
So you did kind of embedded, I don't know if you call it embedded, but certainly field work. You lived among the people you were observing, which was the rangers. What did you learn living among them?
Yeah, I would call it embedded, or ethnography is probably the more academic term for it. I mean, what did I learn is a huge question, a lot. But one of the things I learned most is not necessarily empirically, but the importance of understanding the nuances of these dynamics, and that it's not black and white. It's not simple. And even though we know that, we need to be very careful when we do the research to pay attention to those things, and especially when we're making our critiques, so that one, they don't fall on deaf ears because they're seen as just an attack, and two, so that those critiques are able to be leveraged for something productive, both conversation and even maybe more practical issues. And empirically, what I learned the most is really the tensions within the conservation community of how to deal with the issue of poaching and illegal hunting, and that, what is sort of the dominant practice. We talk a lot about the securitization and militarization of conservation, is not necessarily agreed upon by all. And there are tensions and disagreements within the conservation community, within particular and specific conservation areas, of how to address this issue and what are the best ways forward.
So one of the things that you focus on in the paper is social media, and how social media is used to convey a conservation or anti-poaching message. Can you tell us what you discuss in that part of the paper?
Yeah, so the social media really builds on a quite recent body of literature in the few years called Nature 2.0. And I'll just give some shout outs to those really working on that. Bram Buescher in the Netherlands. I think he's the one who kind of coined that term, Nature 2.0. Rob Fletcher, Elizabeth Lundstrom. Those are sort of the scholars I'm building on, sort of how social media is influencing nature-environment relations. And in that section, what I'm really talking about is, how is social media used to raise funds and awareness for anti-poaching purposes? And again, I'm focusing on the issue of rhino poaching in Southern Africa. And so what I do in that methodologically, I think for myself is kind of interesting, because I was on the ground. I was able to see incidents and events as they happened. And then I was also able to follow on social media the organizations I was with, and then see how those were taken up in social media and used for fundraising and awareness purposes. And like a lot of NGO campaigning, the story that's told online is not necessarily the full story of what happened, or it may even be I don't want to call it a complete fabrication, but it may skew things. And so that section of the paper is really looking at how does this particular NGO, I won't name them here. If you want to know who it is, you can read the paper.
Good tease.
But who the particular NGO, how do they essentially promote their work, which is a very top-down, heavy-handed, what someone called militarized or paramilitarized anti-poaching approach? How do they justify it? How do they frame the problem? And then my critique is sort of deconstructing that message and also why that message matters to how we actually do conservation on the ground and the implications it has.
And so what do you find? What do you conclude?
I conclude that it's a rather simplistic message that's being communicated to the public, and the public is really looking to a donor community. And the simplification really lies at the heart of what is the problem, how do we understand it, and then based on that, how do we understand the solution? And the representations that are really put forward are the simplistic idea of ranger as hero, poacher as evil, and we can address the poaching issue by having a more forceful armed conservation that prevents that poacher from essentially getting to the rhino. So it's a very law enforcement, spatial policing way of doing things, and it's touted as, this is a responsible and effective solution. The other thing is that framing of the poacher as evil also comes into play in terms of the way violence is framed. And it's always the poacher is a violent actor. The poacher is a violent actor is attacking our rangers. And in sort of dissecting those stories, what I show is that the nuances and complexities of what's happening on the ground are lost. The questions around why is an individual motivated to risk their life to go hunt a rhino is lost. These are the poorest areas in the world. Mozambique, I think, recently was named the fourth least developed country according to the Human Development Index. And this is one of the poorest areas in that country. That story is lost. So if you frame it as just greedy, evil people going to kill rhinos, and it can be stopped by a paramilitary approach, then that's the approach you're going to take. And what's lost, and I think what we need to focus on more is, those long-term issues and systemic issues and root causes of why do people risk their lives to go hunt animals.
So there's certainly a wealth or opportunity aspect to the analysis. Do you also see racial issues in there?
There are definitely racial issues, especially in this context of the South Africa-Mozambique borderlands. There's a long history of racial tension, racial politics, racial injustice. Conservation in Southern Africa is still largely a white man's, and I say man on purpose, a white man's domain, usually white South Africans. And in this particular area, even though we're in Mozambique, the managers, those in charge of protected areas and of anti-poaching units are, for the very large part, white South Africans. And they're replicating these apartheid-era tactics in defense of the rhino and of elephants. So the optics of it are really bad. And I can give some key examples here of there are people in charge of running anti-poaching informant networks in the Mozambican borderlands. And they're the very same individuals who ran apartheid area informant networks in the same borderlands. So white special forces South Africans who work for the apartheid government to destabilize Mozambique are now running informant networks in the same areas. So not saying that what they're doing is, good or bad, we can leave that aside, but the optics of that are horrible. And it often is a white savior mentality in terms of saving the species against poor black Africans. With that said, there is a lot of attention, and I think this is a good thing, being given to African rangers. But I think one thing with that is the trope of the ranger as a hero actually does a disservice to them. And it's difficult to make that critique because people say, well, are you against rangers? They are heroes. No, I'm not against rangers. But if we sort of romanticize the realities and, sort of hide them behind this facade of heroism, then we don't actually get the real insight into their daily realities and the challenges and difficulties they face, which is important not only for them being able to do their job better, but for them as human beings and taking care of them and the challenges they face day to day.
Interesting. So Francis, if someone said to you that they were considering going on what you term anti-poaching tourism, an anti-poaching tourism experience, what would you say to them?
I would say go. For two reasons. I think one, just from a financial aspect, I'm not criticizing fundraising. Conservation is, an arena that is severely underfunded and it needs funding. And I would also say go because that is a way to gain some insight into the realities on the ground. And as I say in the paper, it's a curated experience, but it's still a closer experience to the real thing than sitting on your computer and reading a Facebook post. But what I would say is go, but be mindful, be open, and just be aware that this is a curated experience and you're only being told part of the story and part of the reality. And that if you get the chance to talk to other people, such as the people living within or around protected areas, to do that as well. And not just listen to your hosts from the protected area of the conservation organization.
Wonderful. Perhaps very good advice for a whole range of things we might do in our lives. Well, Francis, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Ready.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Donna Haraway. Either Companion Species Manifesto or When Species Meet.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
If we can call it pro-animal scholarship, which I'll leave that to other people, it would be the first article I published called The Political Ecology of Human-Wildlife Conflict. There is a subtitle there that I forget. Very similar to, I believe it was the article Jared Margulies was talking about, his own work. And that came out of my master's work.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar, or perhaps we could say someone who incorporates animal questions into their scholarship, who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to answer that sort of more leaning to the latter part of how you framed it. And I'm going to say 2 people, because I think they're sort of different generations. The first one is Sarah Watmore, and her hybrid geographies was really influential in thinking about why do our entanglements with the non-human matter. And the other, who I think is taking up a lot of that work, is Rosemary Collard.
Oh, fantastic. Wonderful. Great names to add to the list. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think it's about providing evidence, through our research. That's what we do. Providing evidence of why our relationships with animals matter, why we should take them seriously, and why thinking about them differently and critical is important, not only for ourselves and animals, but for how we're all sort of entangled and living together.
Wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think if we could communicate with each other better across species.
Wonderful. If we could talk to the animals. So Francis, what are you working on next?
I'm continuing in a similar line of work, looking at the issues of commercial poaching and wildlife trafficking, but moving away from the protected area per se, and looking at other sort of responses, what's called conservation law enforcement. Where is it happening? What other types of spaces and institutions are these efforts happening to address wildlife trafficking and wildlife trade? And how is overseas assistance supporting those efforts?
Fantastic. So how can people find out more about your work?
The Biosec website, you mentioned the team, you can find me there. And I think the links to all the other things are there, but definitely the staff profile at the University of Sheffield can be found through there. ResearchGate, I think Google my name and ResearchGate, and then my Twitter handle, I believe it is at Massé. I'd like to think I'm pretty active, so.
Wonderful. Well, Francis, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal study scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. And we also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account. Finally, don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.